Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Psychiatry Grand Rounds. My name is Tony Rothschild. I'm the chair of the Grand Rounds Committee. Just a couple of brief announcements. In order to receive credit for attending today's Grand Rounds, please complete the evaluation form, which is on the Survey Monkey that was sent by Karen Lambert on Monday, along with the Grand Rounds announcement. The leadership team has decided that Grand Rounds will remain on Zoom for the rest of the academic year through June. But we are hoping that in September, we will be back to a composite of in-person in the amphitheater, as well as it will always be available on Zoom. Next week's Grand Rounds will be given by Dr. Roger Weiss, who's the chief of the Division of Alcohol, Drugs, and Addiction at McLean Hospital and professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. The title of Dr. Weiss's talk next week, Treating the Patient with Alcohol Use Disorder Who Wants to Cut Down Drinking But Not Abstain. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gina Vincent, who will introduce today's speaker. Dr. Vincent is a co-director of the Law and Psychiatry program. And just a reminder, if you have questions for the speaker, please type them in the chat function. And at the end of the lecture, Dr. Vincent will ask the speaker the questions. Gina, take it away.
Right. Thank you, Tony. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce my colleague and friend today, Dr. Marsha Ellison, to do your Grand Rounds lecture. Dr. Ellison's background is in sociology and social work, and she has since become a very well-known expert in various different areas related to psychiatric rehabilitation and recovery. She'll be talking with us today about one of those areas. She's been a full-time professor and faculty at iSpark and what was all the various things iSpark used to be called ever since 2006. And she was very recently promoted to a full professor. So congratulations, Dr. Ellison. That happened actually very recently, and it's wonderful. I'll just tell you very quickly, she wears many hats. She's also got an appointment as a health research scientist with the VA. She's co-director of the iSpark Technical Assistance Arm, where she does a lot of consultation for the Department of Mental Health. She's also Deputy Director for Knowledge Translation at Marianne Davis's NIDLR-funded Learning and Working During the Transition to Adulthood Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. That is a lot of words, also known as the RRTC. Dr. Ellison's research is in employment and education supports for youth and young adults with mental health conditions, knowledge translation and communications and disability research. She also does implementation science research for improving community-based mental health systems and has done a lot of community integration for veterans with mental health conditions type of research. She's been well funded from agencies such as the Department of Education, NIDLR, and the Veterans Health Administration. She has co-authored or authored 10 manuals and over 50 articles and chapters. And finally, she has a very large grant currently from NIDLR for the Center for Knowledge Translation for Employment Research. So she has been incredibly active and productive in her career. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Ellison.
Geez, Gina, thank you. I couldn't have done a better job myself. Appreciate all of that. Yes, I do wear a lot of hats, but today I'm going to focus on practices and policies that support the employment and careers of youth and young adults with mental health conditions. So most of this work that I'm going to present today has been funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, also called NIDLR. NIDLR funds our very large grant. I'm going to move to that for a second. The Learning and Working Rehabilitation Research and Training Center that Gina referred to is one grant within our Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research. So NIDLR funds the Learning and Working RRTC, as we call it. And we, per NIDLR's priorities, the focus of the Learning and Working RRTC is to complete schooling and training for youth and young adults with serious mental health conditions, to discover, research, and find the supports to obtain and maintain rewarding work. And those two things we know can lead to becoming financially self-supporting and living independently. And so NIDLR is funding this work that I am presenting today on these efforts. I'm just going to back up for a second. The Learning and Working Center is within the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research. Our director is Marianne Davis, and she has led the charge really nationally and internationally on understanding the unique conditions of transition-age youth, ages 14 through 30 with serious mental health conditions, and learning and understanding the various developmental processes that go on during this stage of life and that underlie the abilities of this age group to function as mature adults in adult roles. And you can see what some of the unique challenges are here and for this age group that we are looking at. Okay, so NIDLR funds employment. So the question is, why is employment important for youth and young adults with serious mental health conditions? As many of you will probably know, that employment is something that came into the scene for serving adults with serious mental illness, during the 80s and 90s, in the 1980s and 90s, and previously was not really on the radar of mental health providers. However, since then, we understand that poor employment rates increase reliance on disability benefits for income. In fact, if you look at all young adults who are receiving supplemental security income, 24%, a quarter of them, were youth with mental health conditions. So there are a lot of young people who are applying for and receiving SSI with mental health conditions. So you might ask, well, what's so bad about that? That's why we have SSI, is to help people with disabilities to maintain a decent life. Well, the monthly SSI, the federal monthly SSI rate is $794 presently. And that actually is well below the federal poverty level for individuals. Many states do have an additional payment on top of the $794, but that's the federal rate, and there's many states that only have that. So if you are thinking that, hey, if my young person is on SSI, that's not so bad. Well, actually, it is assigning them to a life in poverty. Moreover, fewer than 5% of SSI recipients are employed, and over half of them had no income other than SSI payments. So that's their income. We find also research has shown that once on SSI and federal disability benefits, you get off. In fact, when youth with serious mental health conditions enroll in SSI before the age of 18, they remain on the disability rolls for an average of 27 years. So that's a pretty long time to be living solely on SSI benefits. For adults with serious mental health conditions, the rates of exit from SSI rolls is less than 1%. So the alternative to SSI, of course, would be full-time employment. And if you have full-time employment in the primary labor market, it allows for financial self-sufficiency. So by primary labor market, we mean jobs that are benefited, that are permanent, and also some of my prior research shows that it allows for informal accommodations that give people with serious mental illness more opportunities to work and to succeed in jobs. So our emphasis is on trying to improve the employment rates of young people with mental health conditions. This is a pretty handy chart that shows the value of education, not only employment, but education. And why is it important to get education and higher education? So if you look down here on the blue, the dotted line is the median weekly earnings for Americans over age 25, full-time wage and salary workers. And if you don't have a high school diploma, you can count on $619 per week. And as you see, it goes up with the type of degree that you have. So the mantra is that education pays, and it does indeed pay. And in fact, not only does it pay, but it also really improves unemployment rates. So when there are recessions, we find that people with lower educational attainment are hit the worst for unemployment. So hence, we also focus on education and higher education. And we know that the sooner you can get a young person into the primary labor market, the higher will be their rate of return on their educational investment. So many of you will understand that. I mean, if you don't start your careers until you're, 40s or so, you don't have as much opportunity to enjoy the financial rewards that come with that higher education as if you could have started later. Why is it so hard to get young people with mental health conditions to finish work, to finish school and to start work? Well, these are just some of the problems that you may well be familiar with. Executive functioning issues, time management, handling pressure, memory and retention of information. And of course, there are symptom issues, emotional regulation, challenges with interpersonal skills and behavioral controls. So given that landscape, do we have a problem with youth and young adults with mental health conditions in terms of their employment and education? So sadly, yes. Some very early research, which I will describe a little bit more later, showed that among youth within special education, so this is high school age youth who are receiving special education services, who were identified as having emotional disturbance, they had the worst attendance, the worst grades, and the worst grade progression compared to other disability groups. That means students with learning disabilities, students with sensory disabilities, students with physical or neurological disabilities, students with mental health conditions or emotional disturbance fared the worst. Recent dropout rates show that there is a 35% high school dropout rate. And as you saw, high school graduates were at the bottom of being able to get appropriate income from work. So if you have a 35% high school dropout rate, that means that those youth are not even able to make the first steps into the labor market. Moreover, when they did graduate, a third of them did not receive a regular diploma. They received, certificates of attendance or other kinds of certificates like that. We also show that 42% had never had a competitive job in their 3 years post-high school. So hence, we wind up with a new acronym, NEET, not in employment, education, or training. And sadly, a lot of our youth with mental health conditions fall into that category. So this is more research that was done by Mary Wagner and Lynn Newdom from SRI International. It was done for the Learning and Working Center some years ago. I'm going to be presenting some of their data. And this is data that followed. It was a longitudinal representative sample of youth and young adults who were receiving special education services. Just to say that that's not all youth and young adults with serious mental health conditions. As I'll say later, only a small portion of the whole population of youth and young adults with mental health conditions wind up identified and receiving special education services. But in any case, Mary Wagner and Lynn Newdom followed these students over a period of about 10 years from the time that they were in high school and left high school. So in terms of post-secondary school enrollment, did they go on to college after high school? So the black are the young adults with emotional disturbance, and this green is young adults in the general population. You could see that there's a large gap between those two populations for enrollment in post-secondary school, especially for four-year colleges, 3% versus 40%. The gap changes and is narrowed when you just look at two-year community colleges or career and technical education. So we see that youth with mental health conditions are enrolling more in two-year and community colleges and in career and technical education. What are some of the problems when they do go on to college? We have research that shows that there are high dropout rates, up to 86% are dropping out of college. We also have research that shows that there is multiple entries and leavings of college as youth try to make their way to a degree. There's lower graduation rates, and in the end, less than half obtain their certificate or degree. And we also are interested in educational accommodations or support, and less than 20% of young adults with mental health conditions in college obtain accommodations, even though they are eligible for and could receive other supports. But there's a variety of reasons why young adults are not accessing accommodations, an issue that we're also trying to solve in our later research that you'll see. So what does that mean for patterns of engagement by time out of high school? So again, this is the same research that I described earlier, the longitudinal look at youth with emotional disturbance. After high school, you can see here 41% had neither work nor school, which is a pretty high percentage of those who are in this NEET category. It does improve 2 to 4 years after high school, and greater than 4 years after high school, that percentage drops in half. Where are those people going? Well, some of them are winding up in full-time work, or in part-time work, and also almost a fifth are both full-time in work and in school. So this is a pattern that we've been seeing through various research at our center, that young adults with mental health conditions are managing both work and school, many of them at the same time. So something that we need to address if we're trying to help improve those outcomes. Just to say, if you're looking broadly at the full-time employment status of adults with serious mental illness, they tend to be almost half of those compared to the larger population without mental illness. Okay, so next I'm going to go through some of the research and service models that we've done at the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research to improve these employment and education outcomes. So first I want to just point out very early delineation of strategies to improve the success of all youth, especially including those with disabilities. There is a new posting of the guidepost to success at capeyouth.org. I have the URL down here, so you can download that PDF. This was not exactly research-based, but these principles were very well disseminated and adopted and tested subsequently. So school-based preparatory experiences, meaning when youth are in high school or in college, but mostly high school age, if they have work experiences, and this is the career preparation and work-based learning experiences early in life, that was a very solid predictor of employment later in life. Youth development and leadership skills was seen as very important, and also connecting activities with community-based supports and other agencies. Transportation, healthcare, financial planning, all of those was considered instrumental to improving these employment rates. Subsequent to that, the organization Intact, which is now called Intact-C, the National Technical Assistance Center for Transition, and their focus is on youth with all disabilities, any disability, including youth with mental health conditions. They did a systematic review of predictors for employment and education success post-high school. So again, early work experiences showed up strongly. Career and technical education also. Again, this is consonant with the earlier research on the predictors for youth with emotional disturbance. Good predictor for employment outcomes after high school. Goal setting was found, interagency collaboration, and self-advocacy. So these mirrored a lot the earlier principles delineated by the guideposts for success. So this is research that I conducted as part of our HYPE program that I'll describe later. I surveyed and interviewed folks at 31 mental health agencies that were providing employment supports, education and employment supports for youth with mental health conditions, and who had been nominated by a variety of sources as providing innovative services. This was qualitative research, and we came up with these 5, principal axial codes for the innovative services that they were doing. And I'm going to describe these a bit because they're probably most relevant to you as a mental health provider and the agencies that you're in. We would love to see some of these things happening in your agencies. So one is young adult focused planning. So you begin with goal setting with the young adults. Try to figure out what are their goals for employment or education. We know that young adults have normative employment goals. They want to be just like their peers, and they want to have first jobs. They have families that need income, and helping a young adult and their family understand that a life on benefits is not going to give them the kind of life that they're hoping for. Rather, they should think about trying to improve their education and their work experiences. In any case, if you work with young adults on their felt needs and on their goals, you're going to get a better response. Family involvement is necessary. So if you're working with adults with serious mental illness, there may not be any families. They may not be families you want to engage with. But when you're working with young adults, you cannot separate that work from families, because families are really integral, still very integral in their lives. We found that these programs did psychoeducation with families about the nature of mental illness and what to expect. They help to empower families and train families to better help their young adult with their schooling and employment. Program structure was important. A lot of the programs that I spoke to had a specific model or approach to serving young adults. Typically, this was individual placement and support, which I'll describe later. Also, the TIP model, the Transition to Independence program. And they use these models to help guide the structure of the services. These innovative programs were very much engaged with creative ways to engage and retain youth in services. As you likely know, that's kind of a hard sell, getting youth to come in and get therapy or show up at service agencies. You will wind up with high dropout rates and no-shows. The alternative to that these programs were doing was to, quote, meeting them where they're at. And that was both literal and figurative. So literal, these employment and education providers would go out into the community, to the schools, to the employment sites, to the Dunkin' Donuts, to the homes, and work with them. Literally on the next one, doing whatever it takes. So that's whatever it takes. So some examples that we heard were supported education providers who would text the young adult when it was midnight to say, did you submit your paper or not? Doing whatever it takes. Or showing up at the dorm room and pass notes to students with mental health conditions that were hiding in closets or under beds, and to help them to resume their functioning and retain their education. Doing whatever it takes. The next one is interagency collaboration. Again, the same theme is that you need to reach out to all the other supports that are available in the community. Housing supports, income supports, parenting supports, laundry supports, like literally helping young people. Many of these young people are homeless and need housing and other ways to manage their lives. And if you're going to help with their employment or education, you wind up dealing with all these other components of their life. And lastly, the young adult skill development. So it wasn't enough to try to help young people therapeutically, but you also need to actually teach them life skills, employment skills, and this is very concretely, how do you develop a resume? How do you apply online? How do you identify jobs to apply to? How do you figure out what kind of education and training do you need, and where is that program? Psychoeducation and social aspects, many of these programs were providing those services as well. Okay, so that's like some basic background about how to help young people with employment and education. And I'm going to now present a few specific models that have been developed at the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research. So one of these is the Translating Evidence to Support Transitions. We call TEST. I'm the PI of this project that was also funded by NIDLR. So the basis of the TEST project that I will describe to you was the same a National Longitudinal Transition Survey findings that showed that post-high school employment and enrollment in post-secondary education were correlated with these transition practices: student-led IEPs, a concentration of career and technical education courses, and community partnerships. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research behind those in a little bit more detail, and then what the resulting guides were. So here's data from that study, Effects of Transition Planning Experiences on Post-Secondary Education Enrollment. So they examine students. So these are students with emotional disturbance who are receiving special education services, and they use propensity scoring to compare students who, in this case, took a leadership role during their transition planning meeting. That means their IEP meeting at their high school, versus students also with emotional disturbance who did not take a leadership role. And we found that they were 4 times more likely, if they had a leadership role, to attend a 2 or 4-year college. Then as well, when they had a post-secondary school representative, someone from the community college, like typically from disability services or student affairs, something like that, if they attended the IEP transition planning meeting, there was a whopping almost 30% higher probability of those students actually attending the school that person attended. So we developed a test guide supporting student-led transition planning. And here's our URL. You can download the guide for free. It's available on the Transitions ACR website. And it's a guide for educators. It's not a guide for mental health providers, but it's for those educators who are doing transition planning with young adults with emotional disturbance, or rather with youth with emotional disturbance in their high schools, as part of their special education program. And in the guide, we ask educators to work with their youth, first of all, to help the youth understand what is their IEP. So I can't tell you how many times we have heard from youth, I have no idea what an IEP is, what it's for, what's the benefit, and I'm just going to yawn through the whole meeting. So rather, we're trying to encourage educators to work with the youth to help them understand what's the benefit, what's their rights, why are they having an IEP, and what can they get out of it. We also encourage educators to build self-determination, teach them about how to create goals for their IEP, and prepare the students to actually lead the IEP and practice the IEP. On the left here is a tip sheet that we created for students, for youth. If you are serving youth in your agency and they are in special education services, you can download this tip sheet and give it to them. And it's all about how they can take a leadership role in their IEP meeting, and teaches them a bit about what that is. The next guide about the high rates of post-secondary enrollment for youth who had a community representative, and specifically a school representative, in their IEP planning meeting. We also created this guide, partnering with community agencies in transition planning. So we know that it's really important to try to bring in adult serving mental health agencies and other agencies, related agencies, when young adults are beginning the transition from teenagehood to young adulthood. What happens? A lot of them fall off the grid after high school. As you no doubt know, that the eligibility criteria between child mental health and adult mental health are often different. And so many youth, when they turn 18, are simply no longer eligible for mental health services. Also at age 18, they have to reapply for SSI benefits. So if they were receiving SSI benefits as a child, they may not receive SSI benefits after age 18, and thus wind up with no income supports. Many times youth who are 18, if they're in the child welfare system or the foster care system, they will be emancipated at age 18, are considered independent, although they will have oftentimes few independent living skills. And so we hear horror stories about 18-year-olds who are literally left on the street corner with a suitcase because they are now 18 and they are no longer eligible for their foster care services. Generally speaking, they are unemployed and with no prospects for employment or at a loss for pursuing post-secondary education. And of course, there is a goodly percentage of young adults who also become parents at an early age. So given this, we encourage educators to involve adult community agencies in the IEP transition planning. And that includes mental health providers. So we want adult mental health providers and youth mental health providers to come to the IEP meeting and to be there to help negotiate the transition from child mental health services to adult mental health services. Again, we developed this tip sheet for youth. I've got my crew inviting community partners to your IEP meeting. And really the purpose is to help the young people understand that there's a variety of supports out there in the community. As they turn 18 and 21, they can access those services. Bringing those people into the IEP meeting early on will help make that connection later. Okay, last but not least was the impact of taking career and technical education on full-time employment. So when students with emotional disturbance in high school took 4 credits in an occupationally specific CTE subject, so let's say nursing or programming, HVAC, automobile, they were 4 times more likely to have a full-time employment after high school. And even if they took just one CTE credit, they still had 2 times higher odds ratio of having full-time employment anytime after leaving high school, and 4 times when it was a concentration. So we really started banking on CTE as a good way to try to encourage full-time employment. We created a test guide incorporating career and technical education in transition planning. And similarly, in that guide, we ask educators to conduct career exploration activities, formulate a post-secondary education and training goal, specify a progression of CTE courses and credits that meet that goal, and develop the IEP supports and accommodations that can reinforce CTE learning. And here is our tip sheet, again, for young adults, school that makes sense, taking CTE courses. Again, we're trying to encourage young adults with emotional disturbance. Often there is a stigma about CTE courses, partly maybe rightly deserved, that these CTE courses are just for dumb kids, or they track youth with disabilities into low-wage, dead-end positions. We tried to combat that stigma. CTE has greatly improved, and we'll hear a little bit more about the legislation that made that happen. I am going slower than I thought, so I'm going to speed up a little bit and talk about our research on adapting supported employment for transition age youth. By that, I'm talking about individual placement or support, IPS. If you're familiar with IPS, it was really it revolutionized thinking about employment supports for adults with serious mental illness. And it had these 8 principles. And we found our Gary Bond, who is one of the proponents of IPS, did an examination of the IPS randomized controlled trials for young adults. And indeed, 82% of young adults had some employment in IPS versus 42% in control groups. However, there are issues with IPS, applying IPS to young adults. The gains are modest. They tend to be dead-end entry-level positions. Tenure is questionable, and we know that youth and young adults need education, not just employment, if they want to be able to advance to well-paying jobs. Our early adaptation was the threshold study. We added a supported education component to IPS, and we also added near-age peer mentors. In an open trial with 33 young adults, 42% had college training or employment starts. Not great, but still consonant with IPS employment rates. Some maintained their employment after 12 months. One of the results was we have a tip sheet about vocational peer mentors here available on our website. And we developed a new fidelity scale, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Our second adaptation of IPS is what we call the Cornerstone study. We adapted IPS specifically for high school age youth with a focus on developing early work experiences and education supports to complete high school and transfer to post-secondary education. Here's the manual. The manual is available to you, again, downloadable for free. It has sections on supported education, career goal development, youth-friendly engagement techniques, and how to involve families. And we have a revised fidelity scale that correspond to this manual. It includes some changes to the IPS, the standard IPS 25 item fidelity scale. We talk about texting and social media, assertive engagement, including connecting with the family, and development of a career profile that's guided by work experiences and career exploration. So these are some some of the innovations on the IPS fidelity scale. It also has the IPS education checklist, 10 items about delivering supported education services. So that's all new. This fidelity scale is being circulated and tested and adopted by large mental health agencies as they try to deliver both supported education and supported employment services. The study results for Cornerstone. These are some of the things of what the providers told us is important. And again, these themes are consistent: coaching and skill development, flexible engagement strategies, and close collaboration with families. Quantitatively, we should say that there was a 50% dropout rate from the services and the study. So our final N was 28 when we were like shooting for 50. So this issue about dropout rate from services is large for us to still think about. But of those that remained, 71% had an education or employment start, and 71% had a job at some time. And these are the employment rates at 3 different time periods. And 7 participants were employed at 18 months and had steady employment during the follow-up period. Okay, I'm going to switch now to, instead of employment, to talk about higher education. So this is a study being conducted by Marianne Davis, our PI. She's our director and PI of this study, academic coaching for college students with mental health conditions. So this was a study in which we were employing other peer students who were successful in college to help them. We supervised them and trained them so that they could help other students with serious mental health conditions in college. And these were the targets that we were training them to help the young people with in college: executive functioning skills, resiliency, social supports, academic self-efficacy, self-determination, and the ultimate goal being graduation. The research staff held qualitative interviews with faculty and learned that faculty had similar misconceptions about mental health conditions as much of the general public. They also didn't understand the nature of academic accommodations. There is data now on a group by time interactions over 2 semesters. So past students improved more than controls. And I'll show you this. These are the figures that represent that. For resilience, this is the green are the past students and the controls are in gray. So you can see that there is an improvement in resilience, general self-efficacy, and in internalized stigma. Other targets, there were no significant differences as of yet, but we are continuing to develop to test PASS into universities presently. We've also recently, based on the feedback from faculty members about not understanding mental health conditions or accommodations, the research team has developed 5 videos for faculty members that address some of these issues. These are designed for faculty members in 4-year colleges. You're invited to come and see them on our website and YouTube, and might be helpful as you're working with faculty members yourself. And then I'm going to briefly talk about the HYPE project, Helping Youth on the Path to Employment. The PI of this project is Michelle Mullen, who was an investigator in Transitions ACR. So HYPE was really designed to develop some of the issues addressed so far, meaning that it prioritizes education early to enhance school outcomes. And it recognizes that young people with mental health conditions are both needing education and employment supports, and there's a fluid movement between them over those early years. So it tries to address that. These are some of the principles of HYPE. It's career-oriented services, obtaining higher education so that there's employment in the primary labor force. Purposeful service coordination, financial planning, and also rapid goal pursuit. If people want college, we try to get them into college. HYPE does a 12 weeks of executive cognitive remediation training. So specifically to develop skills and executive functioning skills, working memory, cognitive flexibility, and reducing distractions, calendaring, and all of those kinds of skills really necessary for education success as well as employment success. And in addition, there is a supported employment education provider, a HYPE specialist who works with the young person 1 hour weekly to develop those skills and do education and career planning. So we don't have data on HYPE. This is currently being tested on campuses presently, and we'll look forward to the results of the HYPE study. The HYPE manual is also developed. You can reach HYPE staff at hype@umassmed.edu and learn about its unique focus on skill development. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about policy, and that I think will leave us some minutes for a Q&A session. I'm going to talk about three. These are federal attempts to make a difference in the lives of young people with disabilities, including young people with mental health conditions. So one is IDEA. So that's the basic law that makes available free appropriate public education, called FAPE, to children with disabilities. It ensures special education and related services. It has the child find mandate. Schools are supposed to identify children and youth who have a disability and assess them and determine their eligibility for special education services. However, only a small fraction, and it varies 8% to 11%, 12% of students with the most serious mental health conditions or emotional behavioral disturbances receive special education services. So there is a large portion of students in school who are not identified for special education, don't get special education services, have stigma about getting special education services, but they're out there and they're not receiving services at all. And sadly, these make up the very large proportion of youth who are dropping out of high school, the 35% that I mentioned earlier, who drop out of high school. Okay, so IDEA also mandates transition services. So if you are in special education, then you're supposed to receive transition services, which are to develop an appropriate, measurable post-secondary goal based on age-appropriate transition assessments. And then you're supposed to define the set of services and education coursework to help that person reach these goals. We've developed a tip sheet for students. This is meant to the audience being actual youth with mental health conditions who are in special education, again, to teach them about the transition services that they are entitled to, and to help them make use of those and use them to their benefit. A most recent and important policy legislation is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, also called WIOA. It's a very broad legislation, but it has specific components relevant to students with disabilities, youth with disabilities, ages 14 to 24, and out of school youth with disabilities, 16 to 24. The out-of-school youth includes many youth that you may be serving: homeless youth, youth who are parenting, low-income youth who are not in high school, who have dropped out of high school. Then there are students with disabilities who are in high school, including students with emotional and behavioral disturbance. We do have a tip sheet, what WIOA, the new law, what families need to know. And this is more of a policy brief that describes the law more exactly. The thing is about WIOA is that it's written for youth and students with disabilities. Oftentimes, people are thinking about youth and students with developmental disabilities or physical or sensory disabilities, even though youth with mental health conditions are definitely a population that these laws apply to. But people are not always taking advantage, not recognizing that. And so part of what we're trying to do is to profile how WIOA and these other legislations can be used for youth with disabilities. One of the most important components of WIOA is what's called PREETS, Pre-Employment and Transition Services, and there are 5 of them: job exploration, work-based learning experiences, counseling about transition services or post-secondary education, workplace readiness training, and instruction in self-advocacy. Right now, vocational rehabilitation center agencies, state agencies of vocational rehabilitation, and in Massachusetts, that's the Mass Rehab Commission, or MRC, are all required to provide PREETS to students with disabilities, students in high school with disabilities. They are expected to work closely with the high schools to deliver these services, including to students with emotional and behavioral disturbances. This would be great. We are conducting new research about how we can apply PREETS to students with emotional disturbances, and to develop that opportunity. Last but not least, I'm going to describe the Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act, more commonly called Perkins 5. So Perkins 5 is the broad legislation that provides $1.3 billion annually in funding for provision of CTE, career and technical education, in secondary and post-secondary schools. So if you see all of the certificate programs available for, any of the things I described, like nursing or air conditioning, plumbing, electrical apprenticeships, and so forth, that's probably funded by Perkins 5. Perkins 5 encourages partnerships between educational institutions and business and industry, and it's really trying to align the jobs that are available with the education to prepare young people for those jobs that are available. Importantly, Perkins 5 requires states to recruit special populations, including students with disabilities, into CTE. So the special populations are other populations like low-income populations, populations that, where English is not their first language. But one of those special populations are students with disabilities. So the law is requiring CTE post-secondary and secondary schools to include and recruit them and bring them into career and technical education. They require educational agencies to analyze equity gaps in CTE, and if they are finding that there are gaps in CTE enrollment for special populations, to come up with remedies to address that. States are required to report performance data that is disaggregated by special population status. And there are a number of states who also report on how youth with disabilities, including youth with emotional disturbance versus other disabilities, are doing in CTE programs. So there's a variety of problems with CTE. In general, CTE instructors are not familiar with youth with disabilities, less so with students with behavioral disorders. They may not know how to provide accommodations. There may be a real reluctance to make students with behavioral disorders eligible for CTE programming. So these are a variety of things that we are hoping to work on over these next years. And also, the Perkins 5 requires a formal definition of a CTE concentrator and encourages schools to structure CTE courses to help students meet the course threshold for concentrator status. There is an emphasis in Perkins 5 that CTE courses lead to high wage, in-demand industries for that state. So if the states are required to figure out what are those high wage, in-demand industries and provide the education that's going to prepare these students to accept jobs in those industries. I am conducting currently some policy analysis about Perkins 5, how that's being used by states to prepare students with emotional disturbance in particular for these high wage jobs. Okay, I am about to wrap up this, and I am saying, so what's a mental health provider to do? Number one, support and don't thwart employment and education goals. This is really critical to their lives as adults. So if they have those goals, support them, help them, be part of the team, work with schools, vocational rehabilitation, and employers to keep these young people in their jobs. Employers may be asking you, what accommodations do they need? Are they fit for my job? And your responsibility is to work with these employers and to help keep those jobs going. Link and refer youth to community supports. Focus on functional skill development. Help these young people figure out how to get and keep jobs and education. Understand that this is a unique stage of life, mercurial and with generational idiosyncrasies. And if you're going to work with them, figure out how to text LOL and use the supports that they are accustomed to. Seek peer mentoring supports and use the family for support and information. And then I would just say, don't give up. Young people are tough to work with, and they need you to stick with them. We do know from research that a good relationship with providers makes a difference in a young person's life. And here is my advertisement for reaching me if you want more information and to get references for these slides, and you can also get the slides from me. Please come visit us at Transitions ACR and sign up for our email newsletter and other products. So I think I took us right to the end, Gina, but if there's, I'm happy to entertain a question.
That was a wonderful presentation, Dr. Ellison. Thank you. There's so much important work going on in iSpark, and thank you for showing us a bit of all of it. The very important question that was in the chat, you answered in your last slide, I believe. Dr. Davis, is that correct? Okay, excellent. And so I think you covered everything. And I just want to say that was a wonderful presentation.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's attention.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.